So we want to understand, what are some best practices around setting up an advisory board? Specifically, like understanding how do you compensate advisors?
I'll start with broad ranges and then talk about some of the mechanics of how to think about it. So anything outside of 0.05% to 1% to an advisor is probably not correct at the early stages. Most likely what's probably appropriate is 0.1 to 0.25%. In certain cases, you might want to provide less. So for example, let's say that it's somebody you expect to hop on a call a couple of times a year, a few times a year, 0.1% might not be appropriate. Or let's say someone's actually doing a lot of work for you at the really early stages, right? They're actually like doing putting in 10 hours a week or something like that for 6 months. It's probably appropriate to give them something closer to like 0.75 or 1% or something along those lines because they're almost doing like employee level work for a period of time. There are a few frameworks for this. The Founder Institute's framework, I think it's called FAST, is a really good one. They actually break down in a table what their level of involvement is, what kind of advisor it is, the stage of company you are, and so on and so forth. Those are some ways to kind of like think through what the appropriate grant for an advisor is. The other thing is, I don't know if thinking about things as an advisory board is necessarily the right way because it's not set in stone, right? It's not formalized. Like you don't have to like have meetings with them and so on and so forth. I'd rather think of it in terms of like who are the people you turn to for advice, right? Literally, just that simple. No need to overthink it, right? Who are the people where when you're in a conundrum, you will go to them and like get their thoughts on what you think you should do. The other thing that's useful is try to use your investors as your advisors as often as possible. And I don't just mean the venture capital investors, right? I also mean your angel investors. One thing that we frankly need to do a much better job of is trying to understand like, well, Mr. or Miss Angel Investor, if you thought, like if somebody were to ask you, what is the one thing you're a global world-class expert, what would that thing, right? And we should track the list. And then anytime we have a question, we can look that up in a table or something along those lines and then like direct that question to them. So for example, let's say we have someone who is an expert on sales efficiency or sales operation cycles, somebody who's an expert on pricing, somebody who's an expert on SEO, somebody who's an expert on distributed computing, right? Like you can write down, like you can collect that information with something as simple as a survey. It could be a 2-question survey when they invest in your company. And then if you maintain a table of that, you can actually use them like and have a really deep bench rather than having a board of 5 advisors. You can have a list of 50 advisors, some of whom are getting advisory shares, some of whom are actually angel investors in some company, some of whom are venture investors. So I think the thing that's really hard and it's a problem worth solving is how do you know whom to go to for what? And I think there's some interesting things to be done in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that. Actually, I do have a follow-up question to what you said. But before we move away from the compensation topic, just one question, I think that was a follow-up was, should you define vesting terms for your advisors when it comes to giving equity?
Yeah, sorry, great point. I should have touched on that. So the most common vesting duration for an advisor is 18 to 24 months. Some of these things we learned with trial and error. Like when I first gave out advisory shares for some early AbstractOps advisors, actually gave 4-year grants that were much larger without realizing that, like, wait, the needs of a company from an advisory standpoint are very different in the first 6 months than they are in like 18 to 24 months. So this is why the best practice and norm, and again, this is one of those things where I reinvented the wheel and learned the lesson the hard way. And so now hopefully others don't have to. The norm is to give grants that are 18 to 24 months. And it is appropriate to do that because, like, I mean, 1, you expect to call upon them during that period of time. 2, you do want to vest it over a period of time because some people just, get busy, right? Sometimes an advisor takes on a full-time job when they didn't used to before. They move from VC into an operating role. They have kids. They travel. They move to a different part of the country or a different part of the world near a different time zone. There are a whole bunch of reasons why an advisor, like, it might not even be that, like, they don't want to be helpful. It's just they want to be helpful. It's just not practical, right? And so it's with a vesting schedule. It's a good way to have a conversation to say, hey, this doesn't really make sense anymore because we're not getting what we wanted from each other. And any mature advisor is going to tell you, like, yeah, I totally agree. That's fine. Just turn off my vesting. We've done that for a few of our advisors and it's been on really good terms. So I would say don't hesitate to have those kinds of hard conversations because honestly, compared to an employee, their livelihood's not in your hands. They don't, like, obviously they want to keep vesting more shares, but they're not going to be offended if you say, like, hey, this isn't a good fit anymore. So don't be afraid to have those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, fair enough. Very helpful. And you mentioned, keeping a list of all your angels, your investors and advisors, and then reaching out based on need. What are some best practices of kind of creating your contract with your advisors so you make sure that they're available for whatever you need? Like, how do you kind of structure that into the contract?
I wouldn't recommend structuring it into the contract. Honestly, there are things that are that deserve to be part of legal contracts, and there are things that are just part of social contracts, right? Like a handshake understanding between two people. Things that should be in the legal contract should be things like IP protection, right? It should be things like the governing law of jurisdiction, the nature of the engagement between the two people, and whether there are any conflicts of interest and things like that. Those things need to be addressed through legal contracts. Everything else, I mean, we actually do this for all of our employees. We actually write up a social contract which says, hey, here's what we expect from you, and here's what you should expect from us, right? Here's what we think you can help us with, and here's what we think we can help you with, right? And I think those are things that are just as worth codifying with an advisor as they are with an employee. And I mean, I do think more clarity in those kinds of things is a good idea. I think it's always helpful to put down on paper, hey, I would love to have a call with you once a month, or I would love to get X number of interest from you in the first 6 months, or something like that. I think that's healthy, but I wouldn't put it down in a legal contract, because honestly, the point of a legal contract is you put stuff in there that you would actually enforce. If somebody steals your IP, you actually should sue them, right? But if somebody doesn't show up to a call in 3 months, are you actually going to take them to court for it? No. So then don't put in the legal contract. Of course, not legal advice. You should actually talk to your lawyers about this. Use the templates they give you. But that's philosophically how I think it's best to think about what goes into a legal contract versus not.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And do you have advice on best practices of how to engage with your advisors? So do you recommend like a call once a month? Do you recommend like, based on like when you're hiring the advisor? So if it's super early stage versus later on, how should you engage with your advisor to get the most out of it?
Totally depends on the advisor and totally depends on you. Honestly, like we have advisors that we get a lot more value out of just having an email exchange with them once in a while, and they're always on email. They respond within like 3 hours, and it's always like very actionable. It's like, here's an intro to somebody I think you should talk to, or here's what I think you should do, or whatever the case may be. And there are other people where, in order to get a hold of them, you need to get them on the phone, right? It's just a function of working style. And honestly, I wouldn't say that like there's any standard best practice for how to do that. It's just it's a function of, I mean, that might be the kind of thing that you actually talk about during a social contract, right? It's like, what's your working style? Do you prefer to talk over email or phone? Do you prefer to be invited to our Slack channel? And that way we can ask you questions more spontaneously. One of our product advisors, for example, is on our Slack channel, and Adam and I regularly ping him questions, and that's a pretty effective way to communicate.
Interesting. And I guess my last question on this, which is really more of a personal question, is like, what type of advisors are there? So, what are the different types, and how should you engage with them for your startup?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to make up categories on the spot here. One of them is functional advisors, somebody who has deep topic matter expertise on a specific function, like pricing or sales or marketing or engineering or product or something like that. The second is, I think, industry expertise, right? So somebody who understands, you're in fintech, or you're in ML, or you're in healthcare or something like that, and you may not have the deep topic matter expertise on a certain aspect of it, or you want to enrich. Even if you do have expertise, that no one person can know everything, and so you want to enrich your range of knowledge on that front. The third is, frankly, just thought partners, somebody that you just want to like bounce ideas off of, and they may not be experts on any function, experts on any industry, but you just trust their judgment, you trust their decision making, you trust their advice, you trust that they'll be looking out for you. Right. And we have people in all three categories, for example.
Interesting. And do you think there are some cases where instead of going with an advisor, it actually makes sense to hire someone with that level of expertise in your founding team? Are there nuances to consider when you think about that?
Yeah, totally. I think often what ends up happening with advisors is that they're not available, and that's the only way you can get their time. So, I mean, it might be that you don't have or vice versa, like you don't really have a full-time fit for it, but you just want their experience. But it goes both ways too. People who did join full-time, but maybe didn't work out for whatever reason, continue to stay on as an advisor. You might bring on as an advisor somebody that you actually try to decide to convert to full-time later. So I think it's a bit of you can think it's not actually fluid, but you can try to make it fluid in that sense. And I don't think that's like wrong to do. It's just a function of, I mean, I think if you think someone's awesome and you think there's a full-time role for them, get them, right? that's simple as that. Like go after them and persuade them to buy into your mission and join your company. But if you think that that's not a fit for whatever reason, I mean, I think it's a great way to get time and engagement from people. And the one other thing I'll say, by the way, is a lot of people, this is somewhat frustrating to me. A lot of people actually demand time, like from friends and from networks. And I think one thing that like I always have a hard time saying no because I want to try to help people. And I think the thing that was always challenging for me is at a certain point in time actually drawing the line and say, hey, I'm happy to hop on the phone with anyone for like an hour, maybe two. But if you want more than that, like we're gonna have to have a different kind of conversation, right? We're gonna like my time's valuable, everyone's time is valuable. So like we tried to have the same conversation. Oh, sorry, we had that same internal dialogue when we decided to bring on some people as advisors. Some people were just so proactively helpful. They're always happy to hop on the phone. We found them invaluable and we're like, man, I don't want to lose, like, I don't want to hesitate to ask this person for their time because I find it so valuable, right? And if that's the case, you should just bring them on as an advisor. Again, it doesn't have to be like 1% of the company. It could be 5 basis points. And it could be like, you know, a couple thousand shares or 10,000 shares or whatever it is, depending on the stage of your company for, you know, an hour of their time once a month for the next year. But that's a really great way to get people aligned with you and get like people you trust and respect to be your supporters.